Greetings, Tony Mobley here. Welcome to Conversation with Tony Mobley. I was supposed to report that we're doing a simulcast on YouTube and LinkedIn. However, we haven't figured it out yet. So it's just YouTube tonight. So we want to thank everyone so much for listening. We would like to welcome the listeners in Cincinnati, Ohio on Z98. And you can hear us on the radio by going to z98fm.com. On Conversations with Tony Mobley today, I am talking to Mr. Jon Snyder. That's right, Mr. Jon Snyder. Thank you, Jon, for being here with me today. And this is episode 70. That's right, 70 of Conversation with Tony Mobley. Thanks to everyone for being a part of the journey. Watching live on YouTube or my website, conversationwithTonyMobley.com. Conversation with Tony Mobley is produced by valued audio visual professionals who meet daily on Office Hours Global, hosted by Alex Lindsay. Thank you again, Z98, LinkedIn Live, and YouTube. Conversation with Tony Mobley is about conversations with real people. Last week, we had a great conversation with Ms. Valerie Olenek, and it was a great conversation. Again, I want to thank the team behind Conversation with Tony Mobley and for all of your hard work. ConversationwithTonyMobley.com is where you can go and register for my interactive chat, which is called Mukana. And that's courtesy of Alex Lindsay and 090. For Mukana, you are able to ask questions, get those questions voted up and down so that we can ensure that Jon and I can talk about your questions. So ask your questions in Mukana. Again, you can go to the website, Conversation with Tony Mobley, register, and there you can ask your questions. And so now it's time for Jon and I to talk, and we're going to start with the very first question. Who is Jon Snyder? So who is Jon Snyder?
Gosh, Tony, that's an interesting question, and I knew it was coming, and I'm not really sure how I'm going to answer it. At the root of it, I think I'd say I'm a father of 2 special needs boys, a husband of 16 years. I describe myself as curious, a lifelong learner who has a love of pulling things apart and putting them back together. I feel like I'm generally witty. I'm analytical and relaxed. I aspire to be a philosopher. I'm an Enneagram 5. I don't take myself too seriously, though. Professionally, I have experience as a substitute teacher, a pastor, marriage counselor, a food safety program manager, a trainer, and now I'm a manager of training, quality assurance, workforce management, and customer service at a hospital call center. But underneath all the defense mechanisms, those dreams and desires, I'm ultimately a person. And, as Descartes might say, I'm a thing which thinks, though sometimes I feel, or sometimes I even might believe. But who am I really? I'm just a person.
Well, thank you so much for, that was quite a mouthful for a person who said they weren't really prepared to answer the question. So thank you, Jon, for that. And the next question is, what lessons have you learned from your parents that you're currently using today?
I grew up on an onion farm in Yerington, Nevada. And it's actually in an area that has some of the biggest onion farms in the country. And we have a family farm there. And I really learned the value of hard work, I think, was the first thing I learned from my parents. I started working full summers, 54 hours a week when I was after my 7th grade year. And when you're out on the field and your tractor breaks down, you can either figure out how to fix it or start walking. And I much prefer the former. And so I learned how to fix things and the value of just putting in the effort. I think the other thing I learned a lot from my parents was unconditional love. When I was after my 6th grade year, we went to Ecuador for a summer to help cover for an orphanage down there, and came back to the States, and my parents loved it so much that we ended up moving there. And I lived in Ecuador for 3 years as a missionary kid. And while we were there, my parents adopted 4 different children and showed love to so many, many more. And I think those are the two key values I learned from them that I couldn't have gotten otherwise.
Wow. Can you talk a little bit more about your siblings that were raised by your parents?
Yeah, so total siblings, I have seven. We're a family of seven, three biologicals. I'm the youngest biological, so I had most of my childhood was the youngest, being doted on. And like I said, we adopted four others. Two of them passed away, and they were all special needs. The first we adopted right after that visit down to Ecuador after sixth grade, and she passed away before my parents became missionaries. And then we moved down to operate the orphanage with another family. And in that time, we adopted one other while I was still there. And when I moved back to the States, my parents came back a couple years later and brought with them two others. And so I still have two family members who didn't start in our family but are there now. Darwin, he's just graduated college, and Alex is, gosh, I hesitate to guess her age, I think around 23 or something. Alex has cerebral palsy, and Darwin had a heart defect as a child, but that was surgically fixed. But, my parents always just tried to love those kids as best they could. And at various points felt like they were supposed to adopt them and bring them into our family, and we all did.
Besides school, what were some of your duties when you were working in the orphanage?
I didn't really have very many at the orphanage. I would sometimes go downstairs or take a baby or two, but most of the hard work we had staff who did most of the work. So realistically, it was just being there with them and loving them and playing with them occasionally. The orphanage was downstairs, our house was upstairs. And so I'd go down there occasionally, or more often we'd bring up a child, especially if there's like a sick child or something, they'd bring her upstairs or him upstairs, and we would take care of that child directly as a family, which is, I think, probably how my parents fell in love with the ones that they did, especially so. I'm not sure. I've never really asked them that, but it was, here or there holding children, but mostly being a high schooler.
Okay. Thank you for that, John.
Yeah.
Um, what does your family think about the things that you do now?
Um, I don't know. I've never asked. I think they're proud of me, largely. I know that my wife loves me. I know that I do the best with my kids. And we actually came here to Reno and started working in the call center because of a need to take care of our kids. And like I said, I have two boys, and at ages, it would have been 6 and 4, I think they were diagnosed with autism. We found out that our older child, who's now 12, has a really rare genetic disorder called Cornelia de Lange syndrome. And when they were first diagnosed in Yerington, there wasn't a lot of help in the school system or any medical help, and Reno's the nearest largest city. So I just started looking for work in Reno, and a friend of a friend knew about this job as a trainer, and I had experience educating others, both as a substitute teacher and as a pastor, and thought it might be a good fit. So I applied. And the funny thing about applying for this job is halfway through the interview, one of the interviewers sat up and she said, "Did you know this is a call center?" And I said, "No." But then I figured out how to be a call center trainer. So I accepted that job, and we've been here 6 years now. So
Okay.
it's really been about taking care of my family. When we first got married, I promised my wife that if she wanted to stay at home with the kids, I would make sure that we had enough to take care of the family.
Thank you, John, for sharing that. Wow. Um, can you share the steps you took to get in your current position? I knew you shared that that you basically took the job to take care of your children because of I guess better resources in Reno.
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, I was mostly just a blind application and accepting a job. But from there, I started as what's called a non-clinical trainer, which was basically we have new hires, and it was my job to teach them how to use the phones, teach them some of the basics of the job, and put together a mentorship program for the whole department. At the time, we were about 110 call center agents. And so I would work with other departments to make sure they had good training plans for new hires. And in the corporate world, one of the most expensive things you have is when people leave the job, trying to replace them. You have lost
Mm,
productivity from people leaving the job. You have the cost of trying to train people. They're not very good at their jobs when they start. And so anything you can do to train people well and get them to stay adds value to the organization. And my mentor program was really successful. It cut our attrition rates in half. So after a year, I had half of my job to do. And I started looking for other ways I could help the department. So I started listening to calls to see how we could train our people better. And, you call into these different call centers and they always say, this call is recorded for quality and training purposes. Well, that was me. And I started talking to our quality auditors who graded the calls and getting to know them and working with them to see how we could partner together. They would catch the problems and I would try to help correct the problems. And my director at the time asked me at that point, she said, have you ever thought about being a supervisor or a leader? And would you be interested in having the auditors join your team? And I thought it was good for the company and good for me and good for the auditors. So I said, yeah, I'll give it a try. And really where I'm at now is just by being open to new options and saying yes. So I led the auditor team for about a year, and sometime around then COVID hit. And we had a trainer in a different department leave. And so they thought naturally that trainer position would roll well to me. And so I started taking that trainer role and hired that person internally. And after that, when COVID hit, we were starting to send people to work from home. And we knew that we wanted to make sure that we were really effective and efficient with our resources, our people. And we started a program called Workforce Management. And if you're not in a call center, a workforce management team, basically we look at past trends and consider future possibilities, and we try to make sure we staff appropriately. So we'll forecast how many calls we'll expect to get in and how many people we'll need for each phone line, considering things like lunches and breaks and making sure we're using those well, figuring out how much time do people need off of the phones so that we can have the right number of staff so that when someone calls in, they're not waiting to talk to somebody. And with COVID in the hospital industry, call centers were just getting blown up. So we had to quickly staff up and make sure that we were using our staff the best we could. And so we decided to roll out this workforce management team. We weren't sure where it would go best. And so again, my director, a different director, said, Jon, would you consider leading the workforce management team? And I didn't know anything about workforce management. And I said, yeah, sure, I'm happy to. And so that's why I led the workforce management team. And eventually we did well enough that I was promoted to a manager position. And now I have a supervisor who leads that workforce management and training team. And one of our other managers left, and we had a layoff in the organization. And so we had a large group of people who had no manager. And so my director asked me, Jon, would you consider taking on this team? And I said, yeah. And so now I have a call center team. It's actually 2 call center teams, and the training, quality monitoring, workforce management team. So really it's been, for me, just being willing to say yes when somebody needs help.
Very cool. Thank you so much for sharing that. What are the aspects of good training?
Good training is effective. And it's interesting. Training is a different beast than education in general. When you think about school, you're thinking about how do I encode information into another human being's brain based on certain criteria. And when you get to the training world, the difference is it's not just for the betterment of the person, is you're looking for the ability to do something. So good training takes the right amount of time to teach another person how to accomplish a task. And the best trainers use brain-based principles for learning retention. And we can talk about those if people want. But basically it's a combination of pushing people to learn and giving them experiences so that the memory becomes practiced memory or physical memory, things you can do, and trying to speed that up as fast as you can without stressing the learner out so much that they can't remember it. And it's a constant tension between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. In other words, trying to get your people stressed enough that they want to learn, but not so stressed that they go into the fight or flight response. And so the best training teaches people to do something new in an appropriate amount of time.
Very cool. Thank you so much. And we have a question, and I can't quite see the name. But the question is, your progression. Okay, so Oh, that's from Valerie Olenek, my guest from last week. Thank you, Valerie, so much for tuning in. Your progression through. Okay. Thank you, Valerie. That's Valerie Olenek, and she put in her handle. Your progression through positions is wonderful. How can you better inspire new people in the workforce to adopt that type of mindset? And I want to say, Jon, you asked Valerie a question last week, so she returned the favor.
I know, and you asked her to, so thank you, Valerie. I appreciate it. I guess you could teach everyone to work on a farm when they're in seventh grade, and then when they have to go to the real workforce, it's a lot easier. But really, I think what it is, it's help learners or help new hires, especially people new to the workforce, help them connect what they're doing to the mission of the organization. And that will create a natural motivation for them to want to give their best. I am a firm believer that everyone, whether you're talking about kids in school or kids in a youth group or adults just trying to get by or people in the workforce, everyone wants to do a good job. They want to give their best, and they will live up to your expectations of them. And if you constantly belittle people or tell people how they're doing things wrong, they will live up to your expectations. And if you inspire them to greatness and educate them so that they know how to do the job right, they'll live up to your expectations too. So it's you really want to challenge people and get them into what a Polish psychologist, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, calls the flow state, which is that level of challenge that keeps people engaged, but again, doesn't push them over the edge. And it's a balance of opportunity and capacity. An opportunity, a good example I would say is when I'm at home doing the dishes, the opportunity for growth is pretty low. The challenge level of that is low. And I'm really great at doing the dishes. So my capacity is really, really high. And so I would be in what's called a relaxed state when I'm doing the dishes at home. On the other hand, the opportunity for ironing your clothes is really, really low. And my capacity for ironing my own clothes, as you can see, is really, really low. My wife does most of my ironing because I'm so bad at it. And that puts me into a state of apathy. And Csikszentmihalyi has a whole map laid out. And you want people challenged about 4 to 10%. You want to give them a task 4 to 10% more difficult than they're able to do. And that will cause them to stay engaged and challenge them to grow. And they'll want to try hard, and they'll be naturally motivated to try hard, and they'll give you their best.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And then, can you talk a little bit more about the mentor program and training?
Yeah, we use a mentor-based model, partially because now we're up to 200 or so agents in our department, and we have one full-time trainer, and one person cannot train 200 people. We see approximately 50% year over year attrition. So about 4% of our workforce every month leaves the department and we have to train. And it's just not possible with the size of my team to teach everyone everything they need to learn for 10 other teams. And so what we use is a mentor-based model where we try to outline if it's a task that everyone in the call center needs to do, it's more efficient for us to put them all into one group training with a full-time trainer. And from there, you split people out on the training plan and they go to their team after they've learned the basics. So depending on the department and the team, they'll spend more or less time with my trainers. And so the idea of the mentors is if we teach people how to be a peer teacher to their coworkers, we can give the general information and let the specialized knowledge get handed off by a mentor. So in our call center, there's about 10 teams. Each team has 4 to 5 mentors. Each team's of 20 to 40 people. And my department's responsible for educating the mentors how to teach their peers. So we do general information, and our goal eventually in our department is to try to get my department to teach about 80% of what people need to know. Right now we're about 20% what they need to know. And then we hand them off to a mentor so they can sit side by side and observe the person taking live calls And then they can ask questions about how to take the live calls. And then over time, they can start typing on the computer while the other person takes a live call, and then speak on the phone while the person's sitting there with them. And so basically, we put them in a big group, and then they go one-to-one with a mentor, and they side by side for a bit, and slowly over time, that relationship spreads out as the person becomes more independent. And for us, it's mostly a function of how complicated our systems are and how can we best use our training resources, if that makes sense.
So, how do you identify those that are mentors? Is there
First, we asked who wanted to. And so now it's a combination of the supervisors identify their high performers on their team, and then they approach and ask, would you consider being a mentor? And it's not enough to just be a high performer. You also need to be able to explain information and break it down into smaller bits. You also have to be patient. And so the supervisors now pretty much select the mentors, and then they'll send them over to me, and we do it ends up being a total of about 6 hours worth of training in a classroom setting with mentors. We do 3 or 4 classes a year. And so there I give the very most basic version of how do you train another person that I can. And we split that training out for 2 hours a week for 3 weeks. And over time, and then we help monitor the mentors. We're there as a resource for our mentors when they have questions. We're there to support our mentors. So basically, we hand them off, and then we try to make sure we support the mentors as best we can.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And we want to thank Valerie with a Y, WHY, for her question. Thank you so much, Valerie. And the next question is there anything else that you want to share about job training?
I think if I could share 3 things. There are 3 concepts that if you can utilize these 3 concepts, you'll be more effective at passing knowledge off to another person. And if you don't do them, you're being less effective than you ought. The first is, the technical term is spaced repetition. A lot of times we feel like we should be able to have someone attend a 1-hour class and have them remember what's important. And I think we've all experienced this. You go to a seminar or a public speaker or something like that, and you get really excited for what you hear, and you're sure that when you go home, you're going to start practicing it. And then the next day, you've forgotten 75% of what the person said.
Wow.
And that's normal. That's what's called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And there's some different activities you can do to reactivate their learning to make sure that it sticks longer. So the first thing is, instead of trying to jam it all at once, spread it out over time. It's called spaced repetition. You repeat yourself over a spaced period of time. Specifically, and it doesn't matter how you deliver the training, you need to do spaced repetition. It's the most effective thing in retaining information. And I'm doing it right now. I'm repeating myself over time to tell you how important it is to remember. So if you present a topic, then you want to review it within 24 hours. And then again, about a week later is what I typically do. And then lastly, a month later. And each time you're trying to remind them of the key, most important topics, and that will help tell their brain, oh, this keeps coming up. I should probably try to remember this part. And so the fact that your brain's training itself that because it keeps coming up, it needs to remember the information. So spaced repetition, it's free, it's easy, it's simple. Everyone should do it. And if you join Education Saturdays with office hours and in our Discord, the reason why I put stuff into Discord the week leading up to the information is to start the spaced repetition practice. So people will remember the things that I want to teach them on a Saturday. The second thing is called retrieval practice. And we've all experienced retrieval practice as well. The act of trying to remember something helps your brain remember it. And I'll give you an example of how you've done this. You've probably driven to the grocery store and you told yourself, I need milk, I need cheese, I need bread. I need milk, I need cheese, I need bread. I need milk, I need cheese, I need bread. And you're driving to the store repeating this in your head. You're practicing spaced repetition in a really short version there. Then when you get to the store, you say, I need milk, I need cheese, I need bread. You go to the milk, you get the cheese. And then you walk through the store and you get distracted by something and you ask yourself, what was the third thing I needed? I need na, 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 na. And you have a rhythm in your head from the spaced repetition. And the fact that you're sitting there trying to remember what it was tells your brain, the neurons in your brain, What was that important thing that I kept repeating before? And the neural pathways you use more often grow back faster and stronger, just like a muscle. So that act
Mm.
of repeating, that act of trying to remember tells your brain how important it is, and you remember it better. So how you use retrieval practice in training or education is what we also call pop quizzes. That's an act of, you shouldn't use your notes. So if you're ever trying to learn something yourself, teach yourself, write down as much notes as you can, review your notes, and then quiz yourself. But don't allow yourself to use your notes. Don't rely on your notes, because as you're going through the quiz, your brain will naturally try to build back the things it finds are more important. And so pop quizzes are a great way to learn. Spaced repetition is a great way to learn. And then the last one is a much more difficult thing to do, but it's called confidence-based assessment. When you're testing yourself or assessing information, you want to also understand how confident the person is when they answer the question. Because if someone gets the right answer, but they're not sure why and they're not very confident about it, well, I don't want that person scheduling an appointment. Even if they scheduled it right the first time, if they don't know why or how, it's likely they'll miss it the second time. On the other hand, if someone's super confident about their answer and gets it totally wrong, I don't want that person scheduling my appointment either, because they're going to
Mm.
schedule the wrong appointment. So when you're assessing information, when you're quizzing someone, when you're testing them, or you're signing them off on a competency, you want to measure, do they know the information, and how confident are they that it's true? And modern learning management systems oftentimes have this built into their test modules, but really it's as simple as asking the person a question and they give you an answer and you say, "Are you sure?" And then they will have to review themselves and see if they're sure.
Very cool. Thank you so much for sharing that. We have a question from your friend, Josh Kaufman from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Jon, what aspirations do you have for the weekly education hour that you help reboot? What unique opportunities does this outlet have?
I think Saturday Education Hour will be successful if it becomes the place where teachers go to learn. And so what I hope is that everyone who attends, whether you're a formal educator, whether you're in the education system or the corporate world, I hope that whether you've ever taught someone hand side by side like a mentor, or you just need to teach your kids, I hope you can go on Saturdays and every Saturday find one thing that's worth remembering.
Mm.
That would be my dream. What opportunities does it have? I think it can become a place where we can come together and get the best from the corporate world, from the education world, and from the real world to help each other be better at learning and better at teaching, to make the world a better place.
Thank you, Josh Kaufman, for that great question. Um, how did you get so good with presentation applications like PowerPoint, Keynote, and Google Slides? And I guess I need to share why this question is being asked of Jon. So Jon has done numerous trainings and demonstrations on all three of them: Google Slides, PowerPoint, and Keynote. And being an Apple lover, I love Keynote. But Jon is equally versed in all three. So how did you get so good at that?
Practice, spaced repetition. No, um, yeah, I think it started. I've always enjoyed using tools and applications to make something cool. And the great thing about Keynote or PowerPoint is you can take a discussion or a lecture and help it connect to people by demonstrating and reinforcing the message. And I think I've always intuited that. So when I was a youth pastor and I'd be invited to teach the whole church, I took it as an opportunity of trying to say, how can I bring life or meaning to the words I'm saying with a visual aid? And then I see it and I review myself and I say that, well, that was kind of terrible. And so I learned something new. Eventually, it got to be something that, I don't know, there's something about slide decks in particular that most people do really, really poorly. And
Mm.
I love helping people get better at what they do. And so I taught myself so that I could teach others. But more importantly, generally speaking, I try to be better than most people at most things as if I can. And that's something that I have a natural talent for. And I get to demonstrate my skill, and it helps other people understand the information in a meeting or in a training or something else. So it's really a tool that when you need to use it can be really helpful. And when you use it poorly, it can be very damaging. And so I'm fascinated by that. And it's something that almost every educator has in their toolbox. And so that's why I bring it up on education hours, is because most people need to use it to some extent. And most people can get better at it, including myself. I learn something every week that I lead a training on it. I myself learn something new. And we'll be talking about PowerPoint on this Saturday, the education hour, which is at 8 a.m. Pacific, which is 11 Eastern time. So join us in office hours and you'll learn how to use animation in PowerPoint. And I got some really neat tricks to show that'll help you go from a intermediate user to an advanced user, or a beginner to an intermediate.
You heard it here. You heard it here. You want to be there. If you are using PowerPoint, Keynote, Google Slides, you want to be there on Saturday to get this training from Jon. He is really good at it. I do have a follow-up question to you. What is it that drives you to want to excel? What is behind that? What motivates you to want to be the best at doing that?
Something about the way I approach the world is I see, I've always enjoyed taking things apart and putting them back together. And when I see a broken world, I ask myself, is there something we can do to make this a little bit better? And I don't care especially a lot for accolades or money, or I'm not driven by extrinsic motivators particularly. What I love doing is seeing something and making it a little bit better. And I figure if you do that every day, you make something just a little bit better each day, by the end of the month or a year or 10 years, you get quite a lot of growth. And I like seeing things get better, and so I try to fix them.
I have to admit that part of the reason why I asked the question is that there is a selfish motive behind it. And the selfish motive behind it is that I've shared with you, and I've shared in conversation with Tony Mobley, that I'm working with a congregation in a streaming ministry, and for me, the challenge has been to try to do the very best that I can, and it has more to do with me. And I'm going to ask you about your faith walk in a few minutes, but for me, it's about trying to give my best in what I profess that I am participating in. And so I never really want to settle, because I know that, this might be good, and for other people it might be good enough, but I'm never satisfied with good enough. I want it to be the very best that it can be, because it represents where my faith is. And so that was kind of the reason why I asked you that way. And I admit that it was a selfish reason for asking you the question, but I asked, and I can tell you that if I were not doing what I do for this house of worship, there were questions that I would not ask the office hours community. But because I see it as a higher purpose, there's a certain amount of boldness that I will ask in terms of questions, because it's not about me, it's about who I'm trying to help. And so but when you said that you want to be the best at doing something, that's immediately what came to mind. And so that's why I asked the question.
That's funny. Mine might be because I'm the youngest child and just trying to live up to my brother. I don't know. No, it's interesting. I feel like anything worth doing is worth doing well, but I also don't have any problem identifying there are certain things that are not worth doing well. And I tell my employees this as soon as they join me is there's a lot of stuff I'm really good at and I can help you become better at, even stuff that I'm not good at. What I'll never do, and I'm never going to try to put the time into, is learn how to use our time card system. And for me, it's just a diminishing return. Is I have a finite amount of time, and where I can do the most good is by leveraging my particular skills or my particular strengths and empowering others to leverage theirs. And for me, it's really about it's almost like a cost benefit analysis of sorts, as far as specialize in what you're great at and then put together an awesome team who can fill in each other's weaknesses. And when you do that as a group, you're way more productive, you're more effective, whether it's in a nonprofit or a for-profit sense. It's really bringing the most out of everybody and seeing their unique gifts and talents and helping them become everything that they can become, so that as a group, you're as effective as you can be. And sometimes that means as a leader, it means stepping aside on the things you love or the things you're particularly great at for the sake of letting someone else succeed. And so that's something that I've had to learn, especially in the last year, is how do I set aside and stop leaning on my own strength, for lack of a better term, so that I can focus on things that only I can do, whether it's because of authority or because of skill level or time, and help someone else learn how to grow. They might not be as good at me as it, but that's not the question. The question is, how can I best empower this person to become who they need to be? And so um, I don't know, it's similar but different than what you were saying, and I'm not sure I can put my finger on it.
Well, I think it's important for all of us to want for the people that we support to get better. No matter what it is, you
Yeah,
want to support people so that they can get better. And one of the good things about office hours is that it pushes people to never be satisfied and to always want to get better. So, um, yeah,
that's for sure.
yeah. So the next question is, let's talk about you being one of the leaders of the new office hours education hour. So share something that you haven't already shared in terms of this whole reboot.
Yeah, again, this was me seeing a need and having a desire to help people grow. And I asked one day in an office hour, what's happening with education hour? And Alex said, well, it depends on who picks it up. And so me and Dave Troutman both the same day said, well, I'll help, and kind of volunteered for it. And then now we're leading it. And it's really, again, it's a function. It's less about how skilled I am, and I'm learning a lot through the process. But it's more about how can I add to this community? How can I add my unique value to this community to make it a better place? And right now, it's by being there on Saturday mornings as a host and trying to lead and guide conversations that will bring the best out of the panel. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's a panel-based show, and I'm trying to learn how, as a host, make it be less about the host or the content and more about the audience or producers and the questions, and empowering the panel to do their best. And it's a really interesting problem to solve, is what's that balance and that tension between driving the conversation and making sure everyone else has a chance to really shine.
First, let me say this to you. Thank you. Thank you John, for being who you are. I typically would say this at the end of our conversation, but I think it's important for me to say it now that um, you are a natural educator, a natural teacher. So I don't know if it has to do with your journey. I'm sure that it has. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for being who you are.
Well, thank you. That's really encouraging to hear.
We have a question from Mr. Roscoe Jones from, looks like Madison, Indiana. So Mr. Jones has relocated. He is now in the Midwest instead of the California coast. So he says, can you expand on your definition of leadership? How do you teach it or learn it? What else is beyond wanting to help others?
I think leadership, and there might be a distinction between leadership and management. I am not sure. Leadership is going in front and showing the way for the sake of people who are following you. And so being a leader means identifying where you're going and taking the next step in that direction. So always keeping your eyes forward at that goal you're trying to reach and looking back behind you at your followers to make sure they're coming along. It's setting the pace to make sure no one falls behind. And sometimes it's going behind and helping carry someone along. But what it really is you have a group of people who are trying to go somewhere and they need one person to be responsible for getting the party to their destination. And so being a leader is about seeing the vision and being able to communicate that and make sure everyone has the resources they need to get through that journey. Because if you're a leader and you don't have any followers, you end up being a weirdo wandering around in the desert.
Oh, I hear you. I hear you. I would just add that I think leadership versus management is that the leader may inspire you to want to do better and to achieve beyond your limitations. And the manager just might manage you within your limitations.
I would agree
So,
with that. And I would add, they're both important skills. And every
mhm.
organization, every group needs both skills. And maybe they don't need different people doing the two things. But the managers make the most of what is currently. They make it the group the most efficient and productive it can be. And the leader takes them to the next place they need to go. So one is a little bit more in the present, which you need to get those resources. And the other is to the next step. I think that's my definition of it. I'm not sure.
Thank you, Mr. Roscoe Jones, for your great question. We have a question from Mike Edwards of Brooklyn, New York. His question is, hey, John, what is your top 3 favorite tools for teaching and communicating effectively?
That's a one might stump me. I think for me, the first tool I would say is when you speak, when you communicate, you should review. Self-review or coaching, having someone else review your content and giving feedback, understanding, trying to diagnose what went well, what didn't go well, that's more effective than any external resource you can have, because that will allow you to use targeted practice at specific skills you want to get better at. And for me, what that looks like is I just learned this week that in Microsoft Teams now, if you turn on transcriptions, you'll get a review about your speaking ability. So I recently learned in a meeting that at points I was speaking too fast. I was not using gender inclusive language, and it gave me just a few tips to practice the next time I was there. So it's anything that'll give you specific feedback about what you're doing can help you improve in the future. As far as like books to read or podcasts to listen to or anything like that, for teaching and communicating effectively, gosh, I don't know. It's been so long since I've specifically studied that. I listen to 30 or 40 podcasts a week. And so I guess I just listen to what I like and see what of that I want to emulate and whether it's a podcast or a YouTube video. I'll have to get back to you, Mike, on other specific tools for communication, because I know there's some and they're just not coming to mind right now.
Thank you, Mike Edwards, for that great question. And now we're going to talk about your faith walk. So anything you want to share regarding that?
Yeah, like I said, I was when I actually went to college to be a youth pastor, and that was because when I was in high school, I had an adult who cared about me and spoke into my life and challenged me and encouraged me to grow. And because she did that, that made me decide that that's what I wanted to spend my life doing, was challenging others to grow and be the best they can be. And as a Christian, I'm fascinated with Jesus of Nazareth, and I try to follow Jesus as best I can. And it's really, as a parent of special needs kids, I think that's the hardest thing for me. Is we've tried going to different churches here in Reno, and for the most part, it seems like people really want us there, but they don't want to help us where we're at. And I think that's a real challenge for anyone in any community, but especially churches and church leaders. And I don't hold this against them. I was a church leader, and I understand how difficult it is to care for people like this. But there is a difference between desiring to do something and actually doing it. And to care for the least of these, as Jesus would say, is something that I don't see a lot of in the Christian community compared to talking about caring for people. And I feel like as a Christian, the most important thing we can do is try to follow in the way of our founder, to try to, I think if we could only, the Christian faith community could do one thing and just read the Sermon on the Mount and treat other people according to that, that would be a lifetime of learning and growing. And maybe then we would really demonstrate to the world the care and love of Jesus Christ. And that's what I try to do and aspire to do, although I myself fail at it every day with my kids, with my family, with my wife, with my employees, with my colleagues, with my friends. But it's something that I aspire to.
Thank you, John, for sharing that. Roscoe comes back with, what are your favorite podcasts you listen to?
Favorite podcasts? Oh, I'd have to look at my phone. I listen to a lot of tech podcasts. I like Accidental Tech Podcast, I think, is a good one. There's a great management podcast called Manager Tools that if you have employees, I think you should listen to. They will give you the fundamentals of leading a group of employees and managing a team. And I think that's probably the most valuable professional podcast I've ever listened to. But I also really like listening to podcasts about economics, like Planet Money or Freakonomics are two of my favorites. So those are a few that I'd recommend most people would get something out of.
Mike Edwards is back, and he says, hey, John, outside of Jesus, which Bible character inspires you the most as a teacher / communicator?
As a communicator? Well, there's a tricky one. Interesting thing about most of the people in the Bible, the people who communicated oftentimes were killed for it. So, I'm thinking of like a lot of the Old Testament prophets, or even the New Testament, the apostles. I think the one I probably connect with personally the most, the one that I relate to the most, I don't know, maybe like the Apostle John. He seems like a little bit of an odd duck, and sometimes I feel like I'm a bit of an odd duck. I feel like I'm not quite as technical as the Apostle Paul, but there's quite a few people in the Old Testament that I think are also worth learning from.
If I had to answer that question, I think that I would say the Apostle Paul. And the reason why I would say that is because he was intentional in that he wanted to make sure that the whole world was inclusive in the in the salvation of Jesus. So
Mm.
I will. I
I'd like
will.
to amend my answer if that's okay. Not a Bible character, but within the history of Christianity. I think Augustine of Hippo, I think I feel a closer connection to him as a person. And that's because he was an orator who was famous and he had everything he wanted. And he found that it just didn't add value. And I feel like that's been a bit of my journey. And maybe whoever wrote the Ecclesiastes might be related to me as well. But it's that feeling of you can live in plenty and you can live in want. And ultimately, all of that is there's not there's no ascribed value to that. You're not better for one or the other. You're not worse for one or the other. It's really understanding that you are where you are and accept where you are and who you are. And that will help you feel less pain. I think there's a lot of stress and worry in this world from those people who are worried about the future or regretting the past instead of learning how to be who they are in the present. And I feel like Augustine lives that, especially in his Confessions, as a model.
So you're gonna throw up Augustine. So I might want to counter with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was sacrificed in Christianity in Germany.
Like I
But
said,
we
the
we
ones who are good communicators end up dying.
yep. So this is probably for another conversation that we may have later in this year. Um, but this is a conversation with Tony Mobley, and we do talk about religion, and it is a ecumenical conversation. So we talk about all faiths. So there is room for a conversation amongst all faiths. So I wanted to share that. Mike, thank you, Mike, so much for that question. Roscoe is back. Does it bring you joy to know your children will be perfected in the next life, or do you see them as perfectly made now? Wow, what a great question.
I think, yeah, I think every parent of special needs has struggles. Our life is harder than a lot of people's, probably in a lot of ways. I think we all have struggles, and again, it's learning to live with what you have, not what you don't. And so I don't think a lot about what life after life might look like, especially with my kids. Nor do I think they're perfect now, but that's because they're kids, not because of their special needs necessarily. What I try to do is receive the world as it is and not how I would want it to be, because otherwise, it's really easy, especially as a parent of special needs, to get wrapped up in disappointment and stress. And I still do that every day. So I don't know the answer to that question, Roscoe, but what I do know is I feel better when I accept the moment for what it is and not what it's not. And that includes with my kids.
I'm wondering, do, have you been able to, aside from you and your wife, have you been able to resource advocates for your children?
We have a few partners. They're mostly state. So our state has what's called a regional center, and we have a caseworker who helps us navigate the different systems and processes. But really, the biggest thing in our life is our loving extended family. I know, like, my mom's going to come. Don't tell my kids this, but she's going to come pick up the kids tomorrow, and we're going to have a weekend off. And it's because of that, and my brothers and sisters and my wife's family. Everyone cares for us as people and wants to do what they can to help and take care of us. And it's imperfect, certainly, and they don't understand. They'll never understand, what it's like to try to take kids on a trip and the stress that gets involved there, and why we get so strict about going to bed on time. But what we know is they want to help. And so we try to accept their help for where we can and try to help explain where it's not helpful and try to just navigate as best we can.
Very cool. Thank you so much for sharing that. Can you share a past success story and a recent one?
Past success story. I think I'm really proud of the work that I've done with our workforce management team. And a specific example is one of the teams that rolls up to me is our operators. They're at our hospital 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And so we need to make sure we have the right number of people all year long. We lost a staff member with those layoffs I mentioned a year ago. And through training, through changing up schedules, through appropriate forecasting, that team is doing a better job answering phones quickly so that patients who are sick, who are hurting, who have family members in the hospital can get through to where they need to get through. We're doing better this year than we were doing before when we had more people. So we're doing more with less, and I'm really proud of that. A more recent success story, last January, I started a master's degree, and I think I'll be able to finish it in the next 3 weeks or so. So
Fantastic. Congratulations.
thank you. So I'm pretty proud of that. It's been, I've been laser focused on that all my weekends and stuff and nights, and I'm really glad to have accomplished that.
That's great news, John. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
What are you most concerned for the future?
Personally, my biggest concern, I think, is trying to make sure that however long I have to live, my kids are taken care of after we leave. Especially our oldest, his disability is such that it's unlikely he'll be able to hold down a job or live on his own. And so trying to make sure that we have the resources in place. And I've always just hated being financially driven, but over the last couple of years, as I've gotten a little bit older, suddenly it's become very important to me to make sure, not so that I can be rich, but to make sure that they can be in a home that will take care of them so that they can live the longest and healthiest life that they can. And that's for both my kids.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, John. Roscoe's back. He says, how do you maintain humbleness and approachability when you are so well spoken and good at teaching?
Well, hard to be humble now. Thanks, Roscoe. I've got plenty of people in my life who see every side of me and help me stay accountable. Chief of which is my wife, Karen, and I think it's really a function of recognizing we are where we're at, and we oughtn't expect other people to be the same place as us, and trying to meet people where they are too. So humility, I think, is largely recognizing who you are, where you are, making the most of that, while trying to minimize your ego. And for me personally, I think the best tool for that. Oh, that was a great question earlier, is how to get better at communicating. I think a great tool for it is learning the Enneagram, and learning it deeply and it helps you understand who you are and what defense mechanisms you've put up and how it's shaped you as a person. And it teaches you compassion for people who are different than you, as well as how to best communicate with them.
Thank you, John. One last question. Looking at where you are now, what's next for you?
Well, I'm hoping that with graduating school, I'll be able to take a little bit of time off and then really throw myself a little bit more into the office hours community and be a resource there with the skills I have to help however I can. I think that's personally what I look forward to, that the office hours community has been a great outlet and learning experience for me because it's a whole bunch of people who specialize in stuff that I know nothing about and I can glean stuff from and just get a little bit better at. And otherwise, I'm just kind of taking it a day at a time and waiting for the next opportunity to present itself so I can say yes to it. I don't know what that is.
And I'm going to ask one more question. You're speaking to the world. What do you want them to know?
Especially as we're going into election season. And Nevada's a battleground state, and I'm getting 10 to 15 nasty text messages a day. Every commercial is about how bad the other side is. If I could share one message to the whole world, it would be, there is no them. We are all us. And tribalism and scapegoating mechanisms are ways that we choose to separate each other so we can feel better about ourselves. It's not helpful, it's destructive, and really, we have a lot more in common than we do different than each other. And if we could just recognize that, and that we scapegoat others so we can try to feel better about ourselves and our communities, I think the world would be a much better place.
Thank you, Jon Snyder, for this conversation. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you. I appreciate all of your comments. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of the producers of these great questions. I want to thank Kimberly Mobley, Ron Mobley, Global Family and Friends, Alex Lindsay, Office Hour members, DVE Store, Liminal Entertainment Technologies, Byte Hive, VDO360.com, ApproveAlone.com, Cloud Bedrock LLC, Ken Jordan, Jonas Dattel, Aaron Husledge, Cherrick Cheetah, David Brady, Marcus Lee Folk, Richard Lavery, Chris Fenwick, Manolo Lozano, Jeffrey Powers, Bo Cordell, Mickey McAture, Hasma Geiger, Doug Moeller, Bryant Shan, Dennis Champion Walker, Roscoe Jones, George Butters, Joshua Minden, Daniel Maxwell, Taylor Sunderhouse, Adrian Allback, Michael Marv, Zachary Sorensen, and Conversation with Tony Mobley producer Clarlock Miguel Lopez Waterman. Thank you all so much. I want to thank you so much, everyone, for this opportunity to have conversations with Tony Mobley. And I want to say a special thanks to Taylor Sunderhouse and 98.1fm.com of Cincinnati and the internet. And I want to say thank you again, Jon, so much for our conversation tonight. Next week, we will have Dr. John Idelson, and he'll be talking about the Ports Project of California. And you don't want to miss this. This is going to be a very important, informative conversation about this project that Dr. Idelson has been working on. So we want to say, again, thank you all so much. We will see you next week. Take care and have a great weekend. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.